Somewhere in America right now, there is a locker, a safe, a storage unit, sealed, silent, waiting. It holds something its owner never intended anyone to find. Maybe it is sitting in a self-storage facility off a highway due outside Phoenix. Maybe it is bolted behind the drywall of a house that just went on the market. Maybe it is rusting at the back of an elementary school hallway in rural Kansas. You would never guess what is inside. Because the truth, the actual documented, police-verified truth, is so far beyond what any reasonable person would imagine that when investigators opened these containers, even hardened detectives went quiet. This is not fiction. This is not a creepypasta. Every single story you are about to hear is real. And by the time we reach number 1, you will never look at a locked door the same way again. Stay with me, because the very first one is enough to make your skin crawl before we even get to the worst of it. The Stalker's Arsenal, Long Beach, California. There is a rule most parents learn the hard way. The only acceptable window of time to have a headless doll in your home is the roughly 4 minutes between the family dog ripping it apart and the moment you discover the carnage and throw it in the trash. Outside of that narrow window, a decapitated doll is, at best, unsettling. At worst, it is a warning sign. Now picture not one headless doll, but a headless baby doll, placed deliberately at the center of a storage unit packed wall to wall with knives. That was the scene investigators encountered after tracking down Raymond Dale Hoskins, following his escape from a secured psychiatric facility in Southern California in early 2012. Hoskins had been committed after a court found him mentally unfit. But his obsession had never faded, and his storage unit in Long Beach proved it. When the door rolled up, law enforcement found something that read less like a personal storage space and more like a shrine. Dozens of bladed weapons were arranged with a care that suggested purpose rather than chaos. The headless baby doll sat at the center of the collection like a grotesque centerpiece. Flanking it were items that seemed almost absurd in their contrast. A garish clown mask with hollow painted eyes, a sumo wrestler figurine, a child's backpack printed with a cartoon character. But the true horror was not in the objects themselves. It was in understanding why they were there. Hoskins had previously been convicted of making credible threats against a high-profile celebrity, threats specific enough and sustained enough that the court had determined he posed a genuine danger. His letters, intercepted over a period of months, described a fixation that had consumed his life. The celebrity had obtained a restraining order after Hoskins reportedly appeared at her residence multiple times, and yet even from inside a psychiatric ward, the obsession continued. The storage unit was, investigators concluded, a staging ground, a place where the fantasy was kept alive between episodes of real-world pursuit. The headless doll, the knives, the mask, to the untrained eye, random. To a forensic psychologist, a portrait of a mind that had constructed its own internal logic, one that no longer required the consent of reality to function. The unit was cleaned out. Hoskins was returned to custody. But the image of that storage room, cluttered, deliberate, private, stuck with everyone who walked through it. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again in your mind. The safe in the boys' room, suburban Ohio. Martin and Carolyn Aldridge considered themselves attentive parents. Their 10-year-old son, Eli, was quiet but bright, a kid who spent his afternoons in the backyard or building things in his room. Nothing about him suggested trouble. Nothing prepared them for what Carolyn found tucked behind a stack of board games in his closet on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon. A combination safe, small enough to carry, heavy enough to mean it had been there for a while. When Carolyn asked Eli where he had gotten it, he said nothing. When Martin pressed him on what was inside, Eli crossed his arms, looked at the floor, and, in the language of an American kid who had apparently watched too many courtroom dramas, told his father he was pleading the fifth, a 10-year-old, invoking his right to remain silent. To his own parents, Martin, a former Marine with a practical approach to most problems, eventually worked the combination lock open with a set of tools from the garage. What fell out when the door swung open sent him stumbling backward into the hallway. The severed head of the family's recently deceased beagle, Scout, had been packed inside. Scout had died of old age 3 weeks earlier. The family had held a small backyard burial, tears, a wooden cross marker, a proper goodbye, or so they thought. Because that same evening, while his parents watched television downstairs, Eli had gone back outside with a kitchen knife, dug up the grave, and carried out what he later explained with complete sincerity was an act of love. "I didn't want to lose Oliver," he told his mother afterward. "I wanted to keep a part of her with me forever." Child psychiatrists who were later consulted described the act as an extreme but not unprecedented manifestation of grief in children who struggle to process permanent loss. The clinical language was comforting in the way that clinical language always is: precise, controlled, and entirely incapable of capturing the raw shock of a father finding his dead dog's head in a metal box. Scout's remains were reinterred. Eli began seeing a therapist twice a week. The safe was disposed of. Martin Aldridge, when interviewed for a local paper a year later, said only this: he still sometimes pauses before opening anything in his son's room, just for a second, just to brace himself. The Medical Examiner's Private Collection, Pensacola, Florida. Dr. Gregory Halverson had a distinguished career. For nearly 2 decades, he served as a medical examiner across several Florida counties. A calm, methodical professional who spent his working hours performing autopsies, filing reports, and helping families understand how their loved ones had died. He was, by all outward appearances, exactly the kind of person you would want performing that work. The cracks began showing in 2003 when the state medical board terminated him for cause: a chronic backlog of incomplete autopsy reports, cases left unfinished, findings never filed. In a field where precision and timeliness are not merely professional standards but legal obligations, Halverson had let things slide. Badly. He was stripped of his position and quietly moved on. But Halverson had been quietly moving things elsewhere long before that. In August 2012, a buyer at a storage unit auction in Pensacola won the contents of a delinquent unit for $40. What he found inside the unit ended his enthusiasm for storage auctions permanently. Specimens. Dozens of them. Preserved human brains, at least 10, floating in jars of formaldehyde. Hearts sealed inside repurposed food containers. Lung tissue in specimen cups. Additional organ samples layered inside ordinary trash bags, their edges dark with age. One heart had been stored in a styrofoam coffee cup, its cracked lid allowing formaldehyde to slowly seep through the cardboard box surrounding it. The smell, the buyer later told investigators, hit him like a wall the moment the unit opened. Authorities traced the unit back to Halverson and launched an investigation that would take months to untangle. The body parts, forensic teams determined, had been harvested during private autopsies Halverson had conducted, outside his official capacity, outside proper oversight, inside funeral homes across northern Florida, where he had maintained informal working relationships even after his termination. Halverson had not been selling the tissue. He had not been conducting unofficial research with proper documentation. As far as investigators could determine, he simply had not wanted to let certain cases go. Or perhaps certain specimens had struck him as significant in ways he never explained. He was charged with multiple counts of abuse of a corpse. Families who had buried their loved ones believing those burials were complete received notifications that they were not. The styrofoam cup became a kind of grim symbol of the case, the casual indignity of it. The coffee shop container holding someone's heart, leaking quietly for years inside a rented storage unit, while the world went on completely unaware. Grandma in storage, Clearwater, Florida. For most families, falling behind on a storage unit bill means a stressful call from a collection agency and the eventual loss of some old furniture. For the Fenwick family of Clearwater, it meant something considerably more complicated and considerably more illegal. Unit 14C at a storage facility on the east side of the city had been rented for years. The Fenwicks paid regularly, then irregularly, then not at all. When the facility manager began the delinquency process in the spring of 2012, he sent the standard notices. The family ignored them. When he informed them that the unit's contents would be auctioned, they called immediately. Within 20 minutes of that call, 3 family members arrived at the facility. They were not there to pay the bill. They were there to explain. Inside Unit 14C, resting inside a pale blue wooden coffin between stacked boxes of old clothes and a broken television set, were the skeletal remains of Margaret Fenwick, the family matriarch, born New Year's Day 1901, dead since 1996. For 16 years, Grandma Margaret had not been buried. She had been stored. The family's explanation, offered haltingly and incompletely to both the facility manager and the sheriff's deputies who arrived shortly after, involved a dispute over burial plots, a delayed funeral that was never rescheduled, and a general inability to agree on what to do with her. The coffin had been properly sealed by the Alabama funeral home that prepared her remains, which, explained investigators noted, why the unit had generated no complaints about odor despite the Florida heat. Margaret Fenwick's remains were finally interred in a municipal cemetery 6 weeks after the discovery, in a small service attended by a handful of family members and a county social worker assigned to close the case. The storage unit was released. The family dispersed. No charges were filed, as no Florida statute specifically prohibited what they had done. A legal ambiguity the county attorney described, with visible discomfort, as something the legislature might want to address. Somewhere in county records, Margaret Fenwick's death certificate still shows 1996 as the year of burial. It took 16 years, a delinquent payment notice, and a storage auction to make that technically true. The body in the locker, Boulder, Colorado. Public swimming pools carry their own particular set of anxieties for certain people. The water quality, the other swimmers. The locker room, with its particular combination of vulnerability and shared space that makes most adults vaguely uncomfortable, even under the best circumstances. Harold Prewitt was 71 years old and had been swimming at the same municipal pool in Boulder, Colorado for nearly a decade. He came 3 mornings a week, used the same locker every time. Number 47, second row from the back, and had developed the kind of comfortable routine that older adults build around physical activity when they find something that works. On a Wednesday in late October, he came off the pool deck slightly more tired than usual, his coordination perhaps slightly off, and reached for the wrong locker. Number 49. One to the right of his usual spot, the door swung open. What came out of it, or rather what collapsed out of it, spilling forward as the pressure of the door's release sent it tumbling, was the skeletal remains of a human being, fully decomposed, still dressed in the remnants of clothing that forensic examiners would later estimate as being at least 4 years old. Prewitt stumbled backward, hit the bench behind him, and began shouting. Staff arrived within 90 seconds. The pool was evacuated. County sheriff's deputies were on scene within 12 minutes. The investigation that followed was, in the honest assessment of the lead detective, one of the most puzzling of his career. The locker had no working lock. The mechanism had been broken for years, a maintenance oversight that had simply never been addressed. Security footage of the locker room corridor, which the facility had installed only 8 months prior, showed nothing useful. No camera had covered that section of the room before the upgrade. Forensic analysis established that the remains were those of an adult male, likely between 30 and 50 years of age. Dental records produced no match in state databases. DNA was extracted but returned no hits in federal systems. The question of whether the man had entered the locker voluntarily, perhaps hiding, perhaps in some kind of distress, or had been placed there by someone else was never resolved. The physical evidence supported both possibilities and ruled out neither. The pool remained closed for 11 days. When it reopened, attendance dropped by 60% and never fully recovered. The locker room was renovated that winter. New fixtures, new locks, security cameras covering every aisle. Harold Prewitt never came back. He took up walking instead. The safe that changed everything. Rural Tennessee. Marcus Webb had been a locksmith for 22 years before he learned that some safes are better left closed. Webb had built his side business methodically. Local reputation, word of mouth, the kind of work that keeps a man busy without requiring advertising. Landlords, estate attorneys, and property managers called him when tenants left behind secured containers. He would open them, document the contents for the property owner, and collect his fee. In 2 decades, the most unusual thing he had ever found was a full set of vintage baseball cards worth approximately $8,000. Then a property manager in a small town outside Nashville called him about a safe left in a recently vacated rental house. Standard job. The tenant had simply disappeared without notice, leaving the safe bolted to the floor of a bedroom closet. Webb drove out on a Thursday afternoon. The property manager met him at the door. Neither of them spoke much as Webb set up his equipment, a familiar routine, professional and efficient. He had the safe open in under 40 minutes. The first thing he saw was the grenade. It was military-style olive green and appeared, to Webb's untrained but alarmed eye, to be real. He stepped back immediately and called out to the property manager to stay in the hallway. Later, bomb disposal technicians would confirm it was live. But the grenade was not. Webb would later tell investigators the thing that stayed with him. Behind the grenade were 12 SD cards, each labeled in small, neat handwriting. And beside the SD cards was a journal, black cover, cloth bound, thick with entries. Webb opened the journal. "I flipped through maybe 3 pages, he told the detective who took his statement. And I put it down. I'm not going to describe what I read. I'm not going to do that to you or to myself. Just know that whatever you're imagining right now is not bad enough." The SD cards, examined by investigators with the appropriate legal authority and psychological preparation, were filled with child sexual abuse material, hundreds of files, multiple victims, evidence investigators determined of an organized network rather than a single individual. The journal documented the operation in detail, precise enough to generate 14 arrest warrants across 4 states. Marcus Webb took 6 months off work after that Thursday afternoon. When he returned, he kept a simple policy. No safes found in residential properties without a law enforcement officer present. He has never described what he read in that journal. Not to his wife, not to the therapist he saw for 8 months afterward, not to anyone. "Some things," he said in a brief follow-up interview, "you just have to carry. The school locker and the drawings, Fort Collins, Colorado, 1987. On a cold morning in February 1987, the body of 13-year-old Angela Ryerson was discovered in a field on the outskirts of Fort Collins, Colorado. She had been murdered. The details of what had been done to her body were severe enough that the detective assigned to the case, a 20-year veteran, requested a temporary reassignment after filing his initial report. The investigation moved quickly to the school. Angela had been seen alive near the campus the previous afternoon. Detectives began working through the student body systematically. Interviews, background checks, the methodical groundwork of a homicide investigation in a small city unaccustomed to crimes of this nature. When they reached the locker of a 15-year-old student named Daniel Crew, they did not expect what they found. No one could have. Packed into locker 114, floor to ceiling, folded and stacked with the obsessive precision of someone who had been collecting for years, were over 2,000 pages of handwritten material, stories, journals, descriptive accounts of acts of violence against women and girls, written in a hand that alternated between cramped urgency and careful, almost artistic deliberateness, and drawings, hundreds of drawings, detailed, technically skilled renderings of mutilated figures in poses and settings that, in several specific cases, bore a resemblance to the crime scene where Angela Ryerson had been found. The resemblance was close enough that the lead detective called the district attorney from a payphone outside the school. Daniel Crew was arrested, tried as a juvenile, and convicted. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, a sentence that, at the time, seemed both just and inevitable given the weight of the evidence against him. But forensic science in 1987 was a different instrument than what it would become. DNA testing in its infancy was not yet the precise tool it is today. The biological evidence collected from the crime scene was preserved, but not fully analyzed using the methods available at the time. In 2008, advances in genetic analysis allowed investigators to reprocess the original evidence. The DNA found on Angela Ryerson's body did not match Daniel Crew. It matched a profile already in the federal database, a man with a documented history of violence against women who had been living in Fort Collins in February 1987 and had moved away within 3 months of the murder. Daniel Crew had served 21 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. He was released in 2008. The man whose DNA matched the evidence was charged, but died of a heart attack before trial. Angela Ryerson's killer was never formally convicted. The drawings, the journals, the 2,000 pages of documented darkness from Locker 114 had described a mind capable of extraordinary violence. They had simply described the wrong mind. The actual killer had left nothing behind. He had been invisible, unremarkable, and perfectly free for 21 years. The contents of Locker 114 were destroyed after Crew's exoneration at his request. He never explained the drawings. He simply asked that they be gone. The leg in the smoker, Maiden, North Carolina. When Raymond Tatum paid $60 at a storage unit auction in Maiden, North Carolina, he was hoping for tools, furniture, maybe some vintage electronics, the kind of practical score that makes storage auctions worthwhile for people who know what they are looking at. What he got was a competition-grade barbecue smoker, stainless steel, the kind of unit that serious pitmasters spend serious money on. A legitimate find. Tatum loaded it onto his trailer and drove it home, planning to clean it up and either keep it or flip it for a profit. When he opened the smoker's main chamber in his driveway, the smell hit him first. Then his eyes adjusted to the interior. A human leg, severed below the knee, wrapped carefully in aluminum foil, occupied the center rack. Tatum called the Catawba County Sheriff's Office immediately. Deputies arrived within the hour, and began the process of tracing the smoker back through the storage unit's rental history. What they found was not a murder. It was, in a way that defies easy summary, almost the opposite. The storage unit had belonged to a man named Calvin Woodard, a resident of the county who had been involved in a small aircraft accident in 2004. The crash had been survivable, barely, but Woodard's left leg had been too badly damaged to save. It was amputated below the knee at a regional medical center 2 days after the accident. Woodard had made a decision that his doctors initially assumed was shock-induced and would pass. He wanted to keep the leg. He intended, he explained with complete seriousness, to be buried with it. He was a man who believed in going into the ground whole, or as close to whole as circumstances permitted, and a plane crash was not going to change that belief. The hospital released the limb to him following the appropriate procedures. Woodard took it home, prepared it himself using techniques he researched over several weeks, wrapped it in foil to slow further deterioration, and placed it in the smoker, which he then put in storage when he moved to a smaller apartment 2 years later. He had, in the chaos of relocating and the persistent challenges of recovery and rehabilitation, simply forgotten about it. "I put it there meaning to come back for it," Woodard told investigators, apparently without irony. "I just never got around to it." The leg was returned to Woodard. He was not charged with any crime. Raymond Tatum was given a refund on the auction price by the storage facility, who described the reimbursement in their records straightforwardly as a customer accommodation. The wall safe full of teeth. Baltimore, Maryland. Renovation work has a way of surfacing the past. Behind wallpaper there are older wallpapers. Behind drywall there are newspaper clippings, old photographs tucked into insulation, objects placed by previous owners for reasons that made sense to them at the time and are now entirely opaque. Dana Morley was refurbishing a 19th century row house in Baltimore's Federal Hill neighborhood when her contractor called her down from the second floor to look at something he had found in the living room wall. A safe. Small, older, set flush into the original brick behind a layer of plaster that had been applied sometime in the mid-20th century. Someone had sealed it into the wall deliberately, covering it completely. Morley, who had bought the house specifically for its history and the stories she imagined it contained, felt a genuine rush of excitement. She called a locksmith. The locksmith arrived the following morning and had the safe open in under an hour. Morley stood back, expecting, she would admit later, something cinematic. Documents, cash, jewelry, the romantic contents of a century-old secret. What she got was teeth. 22 of them, loose inside the safe's small interior, resting on what appeared to be a folded piece of velvet that had partially disintegrated with age. Human teeth, a mix of molars, premolars, and incisors, in various stages of wear consistent with a range of ages. Some showed signs of early dental work. Others appeared entirely natural. Forensic dentists who examined them estimated they dated from the late 19th to early 20th century. The house had been built in 1887 and had passed through at least 7 owners in its history. No definitive explanation was ever established. Theories offered by anthropologists and historians consulted by Morley ranged from the practical, dental procedures of that era, sometimes resulted in patients keeping extracted teeth as mementos or for various folk remedies, to the considerably more unsettling. The teeth were turned over to the Baltimore City Medical Examiner's Office, who eventually archived them as historical remains when no living next of kin could be established. Morley finished the renovation. She still lives in the house. She has not opened any more walls. "I know there's probably more in there," she said in a neighborhood newsletter interview the following year. "I've made my peace with not knowing." The crawl space and the tapes. Portland, Oregon. This is the one that keeps people up at night. This is the one that even now remains only partially resolved. A set of answers that generated more questions than it closed, sitting inside a police evidence locker somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, while investigators pursue leads that have, over the years, grown cold. The user who posted the original account on a discussion forum used the handle Brentwood_86. He had recently purchased a house in a quiet neighborhood on the east side of Portland. The house was a 1940s bungalow, solid bones, good light, priced below market because it had been sitting unoccupied for 3 years following its previous owner's death. Brentwood_86 was doing a preliminary walkthrough of the basement when he noticed that the dimensions did not add up. The space behind the water heater alcove, he realized, was larger on the exterior than it appeared from inside. There was space that wasn't accounted for. He pulled the water heater access panel off the wall. Behind it was a carpeted room, small, perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet, but deliberately finished. Carpet on the floor, flat black paint on the walls and ceiling. A single bare bulb socket wired into what appeared to be a separate circuit breaker. And at the far wall, a black painted metal door, padlocked from the outside. He stood there for a long time. "I want to be clear about something," he wrote. "I'm not a brave person. I stood in that carpeted black room for probably 10 minutes before I did anything. I had my phone out. I had 911 typed in and ready. I was genuinely shaking." He broke the padlock with a bolt cutter he retrieved from his truck. The door swung inward. The room beyond was smaller, a closet really, no larger than a modest bathroom. The walls were covered in a material that Brentwood_86 initially thought was acoustic foam. Later investigation would confirm it was soundproofing material, the commercial-grade variety sold for recording studios and industrial applications. In the center of the room, on a metal shelving unit, was a black steel safe, combination locked. Beside the safe, loose on the shelf, a stack of VHS cassette tapes, no labels on the spines. One tape had a piece of white adhesive tape on its side, on which someone had written in black marker a single word repeated 4 times. No, 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 no. And on the floor, just inside the door, a folded piece of paper. When Brentwood_86 picked it up and opened it, he found 2 words written in thick black ink that had partially soaked through the page: "Save yourself." He left the house immediately. Portland Police Department evidence technicians processed the scene over the following 2 days. The VHS tapes were collected, cataloged, and reviewed by detectives. The safe was transported to a secure facility and opened by department specialists. What was on the tapes, and what was inside the safe, has never been publicly disclosed. The lead detective on the case stated in a press release that the materials were being treated as potential evidence in an ongoing investigation, and that further information could not be released pending that investigation's progress. Brentwood_86 posted an update to his forum thread 8 months later. It was brief. "I turned over everything I had to the police. I cooperated fully. I have not been back to the house. I don't think I will be. Some things you can't unknow, and I don't even know most of it. I just know that the people whose job it is to know things like this went very quiet when they saw what was in there. That's enough for me." The house was sold at a loss 18 months after the discovery. The new owners were informed, as required by Oregon law, of the prior investigation. They moved in anyway. They have made no further public statements about what, if anything, they have found. The investigation remains open. The tapes remain in evidence. The safe remains sealed in the public record. What we learn from locked things. Every object in this list was locked for a reason. Every container was sealed by someone who believed that what was inside was better kept hidden from the world, from investigators, from time itself. Sometimes the locking was grief, clumsy and desperate. A boy who could not accept that his dog was gone. A family that could not bring themselves to put grandma in the ground. Sometimes the locking was professional failure. A medical examiner who could not let certain cases close. A system that broke down so quietly that no one noticed for years. Sometimes the locking was pathology, obsession, violence. The kind of darkness that needs a container precisely because it cannot survive exposure to ordinary daylight. And sometimes, rarely thank God, but sometimes, the locking was calculated, deliberate, the work of people who knew exactly what they were hiding and why, who had built rooms inside houses, precisely because they understood that discovery would mean the end of everything. The locks did not hold. They never do in the end. The doors opened. The safes were cracked. The walls came down. What that tells us, what every case in this list confirms in its own terrible way, is that the things we try to keep hidden have a way of surfacing. Not always in time to matter. Not always in ways that allow for justice or resolution or clean endings. But they surface. If this video stayed with you, if you found yourself holding your breath through more than one of these stories, share it with someone who thinks they know what people are capable of. Send it to the friend who still believes that what's behind a locked door is always ordinary. Subscribe if you want to go deeper. The next video goes somewhere even darker, and I promise you, you are not ready. But you're gonna watch anyway. Because that's what we do.